We have not been able to be as faithful as everybody knows in our monthly newsletters as we were the first term, and I think maybe in part that was to set us up for the theme of our second term on the field. The first term we had many difficulties in Mozambique that we encountered, but the Lord was always gracious to almost clear them away before the obstacles actually got in our face. We'd see them coming, but before they got to us, before they had a chance to do any harm, God had already removed the obstacles, and it was always smooth sailing straight ahead. During this past term, we have discovered that the Lord has something else to teach us, and I think that's perseverance in the face of hardship and trials, because that is what we've encountered over the past 3 years now in our second term on the field, and this past year was no different. We had quite a few hardships, and I feel like our theme for this second term is from Psalm 50, verse 15, where the Lord says, "Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me." And this is one of the reasons we have troubles, one of the reasons we have hardships sometimes, is because the Lord wants us to call upon Him, and then He will deliver us. And when He delivers us, of course, we have all the more reason to give thanks and praise to God and to glorify His name. And in keeping with that theme, the past year we've had a number of trials, a number of difficulties, and instead of going away as soon as they reared up in our face, we've had to contend with them and live with them for a while before the Lord removed them from us. But God has continued to be faithful, and He has either removed our hardships from us or He's in the process of doing that. And today I'd like to just share some of the things I think most everybody knows. I won't go through a review of just exactly who we are and what we're doing. Perhaps just to say that my wife and I, Julie and Charles Woodrow, our 4 children, have been missionaries in Mozambique for 7 years now. And very briefly, we have a twofold ministry there. I'm a medical missionary as a surgeon, so we have a hospital-based ministry, and we also have a church-based ministry because we're also involved in church planting. In the hospital-based ministry, we have the obvious medical ministry doing operations. The OR team and myself have done over 3,400 operations so far in these 7 years, and over 14,000 outpatient consultations. But besides the medical work at the hospital, we also have an evangelistic work, which I trust people are familiar with. We witness to all of our patients who pass through the surgical block. We distribute gospel tracts on the wards. We have an evangelistic service every Sunday afternoon. During the past year, we estimate that more than 4,000 people heard a full presentation of the gospel at the hospital of Morer, and we handed out at least that many gospel portions, and we've sold many hundreds of Bibles from the hospital. We sell them for about R1 a piece, and so that's the evangelistic ministry at the hospital. Then we have a church planting ministry as well that's grown out of the evangelistic ministry. We have a church that's established, a Reformed Sovereign Grace Church in Nampula. And during the past year, we've had an average of about 40 adults and 30 children in attendance each Sunday. And that work is going fitfully. We have our ups and downs. We go forward, and then we take a step back. And toward the end of the presentation today, I'd like to share with you what the Lord has been doing in the church. But I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the ongoing stories of hardships and also the Lord's deliverance in the past year. I'd like to begin where we left off. We left Johannesburg in May of last year, and perhaps many of you followed our chronicles as we tried to travel back to Nampula. We had some problems in the Tet corridor. We were traveling down the road in our Land Rover when a dumb Mozambican bull sauntered out into the road, and we slowed down to avoid it. And apparently he saw us and started to head off the road, and so I speeded up again. About the same time, he decided that he'd like to get back to the other side of the road, and he turned back and walked right back in the path of the car. And pulling a heavy trailer, we couldn't do much to avoid hitting him. Thankfully, we hit him in the hind quarters. He went flying off into the bush, and at that point I realized why Mozambique has so few cows, because they seem to be suicidal. Unfortunately, he was a heavy animal, and he completely caved in the right front fender, right front wing of our car, And thankfully the car continued to roll on, so there wasn't a problem with damage to the wheels or to the alignment or anything, but the whole front end was caved in and the hood was buckled. And as soon as it coasted to a stop, I ran out in front to see what the damage was, but I couldn't get the hood up, of course, because it was all caved in. But the car was still idling, and obviously it ran, it rolled. And the only problem I could see trying to look through the grill of the Land Rover was this lethal green hemorrhage coming from the radiator. And I knew that when we lost all of our coolant, we wouldn't be able to drive any further. But we were only 40 kilometers from the next town, Tet, and the only town really of significance on the whole Tet corridor. And so we jumped back in the car and we headed off, hoping that we could make it the next 40 kilometers before all the water ran out. But we didn't. We made it 10 kilometers. And finally the water had run out of the radiator, and the temperature needle began to climb up into the danger zone, and we had to stop the car on top of a hill in the middle of the African bush and pray for deliverance. And about 6 hours later we were able to hitch ourselves to a truck that pulled us on the other 30 kilometers into Tet. And thankfully the next day I was able to take it down to a shop. We got the hood pried open, and the only damage that absolutely had to be corrected was leaking from the radiator, in which they were able to correct. And the same day we got back in the car and headed back to Harare to get the whole front end rebuilt in a body shop, and that delayed us for another 2 weeks. The exciting thing is what happened the day we got our car back from the body shop. We were in a big hurry to get home because we'd already been delayed considerably getting back to Nampula. And so we had the car. Once we got the car out of the body shop, we loaded it up with all of our belongings, and we went downtown to make a few last-minute purchases with the hope that we might still be able to get away even that very day and get on the road again to Nampula. And as we were in town making our last-minute purchases, we were accosted by an organized gang of thieves in downtown Harare. Little did we know that they had infiltrated our own family and had enlisted our youngest daughter, Grace, as one of their accomplices. But this team was very organized, and what happened, we had pulled into a parking space in downtown Harare. I ran inside to buy just a few index cards, and when I ran back out to get into the car, the accomplice of this gang of thieves began her diversionary tactics. She threw her milk bottle out the window of the car. And so my wife had to jump out the window to get the milk bottle. But before she could get her bottle, Grace Ann's bottle, one of the thieves in this group ran up and grabbed the bottle and carried it off about 5 yards away from the car and began studiously cleaning off the nipple and being very helpful. So my wife had to get out of the car to retrieve the bottle and had to walk 5 meters away from the car to get the bottle. And while he was detaining her, a second member of the gang came around and started banging on the back end of the car. And we didn't know at the time what was happening. We discovered later he was slashing our tires. He slashed the 2 rear tires and the spare that was on the back end. Well, while he was doing that, a third member of the team came running up to my side of the car to tell me, as if I didn't already know, that my car was being vandalized and there was a guy that was trying to break in and I needed to get out and chase him off. And so that's what I did immediately. No sooner had I put my foot, though, on the pavement before I realized that Julie's door was wide open and she was 5 meters off in that direction, and I was about to leave the car and go out behind. And of course I'd heard a lot about cars being stolen that way, and I wasn't sure if I'd actually had my keys in the ignition already to start the car. I wasn't sure, but immediately something went off in my mind. I thought, no, I can't leave the car because then any of these guys can jump in and drive off with it. So I ran back into the car, and I just had to let the guys beat on the back tires while Julie finally wrested the bottle away from the other accomplice and jumped in the car, and we headed off, and we thought we got away from them. But we were mistaken. They had another group of people already in an automobile ready to follow us, and this is what they do all the time. We've learned about this scam from at least 2 other people who've been victimized by the same thing. And the thieves followed us without our realizing it as we drove through town, knowing that it was only a matter of time before our tires went flat and we would have to get out of the car, and in the confusion they were going to reach in and steal what they could. And I had my briefcase right on the front seat between my wife and myself. Well, they followed us. We had a number of errands to run still before we could leave, and they followed us to all of these places that we went. And when we reconstructed things later and went back to all these places, people said, yes, there was a white Peugeot with 3 black men that pulled in right behind you and sat right in our parking lot as long as you were here, and then when you left, they left. And we got that story from several locations when after the disaster had finally taken place, and we began to try to retrack our steps and find out how it all had happened. Well, what happened? They followed us around for about 2 hours, and eventually, sure enough, our tires went flat. And I had 2 spare tires, so I replaced one of the flat tires. And they stayed with us this whole time without our knowing it, but we talked to other witnesses later who saw the car following us this entire time. And I drove to a service station later to try to get the flat repaired because we had wanted to leave, and we couldn't leave with flat tires. And I'd replaced it with the spare, but I needed to get the spare fixed so that we'd have a good spare in case we had another flat on the way. And it was while we were in the service station to get the tire fixed that the number one accomplice acted up again. I was out of the car taking the flat spare off the back door to hand it to the mechanic so he could repair it. And Julie was in the front seat with Grace Ann, and Grace Ann began to fuss and cry. And so Julie thought she'd hop out and walk the baby around, and she did, and of course that left two front doors unlocked, the attaché case in the middle of the front seat, and the thieves in their white Peugeot parked nearby just waiting for that opportunity. And sure enough, in a flash, they'd reached inside the front door and carried off the attaché case, and by the time we discovered it, it was long gone. And of course, I guess we all know the sinking feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you're discovered something like this has happened. For us, it was difficult because, of course, we had all of our passports and all of our residence documents for Mozambique inside the attaché case. We had $3,000 of cash, $2,000 in traveler's checks, and $1,000 in cash to get us back to Nampula. But even worse, we had all the documents for the importation of all the supplies that were in our trailer. We were pulling a heavy trailer back full of medical supplies and personal belongings, and we still had 3 borders and six border posts that we had to pass through, and we had to present all the documents and so forth, proving that this was our automobile, and this was our trailer, and the contents were our contents, and proving what was in the trailer. So if they wanted to charge customs, we'd be able to do all that. So we lost all of that paperwork as well as the money. And that was a great setback. And of course, we'd already been delayed 2 weeks in Harare. We'd expected to be back in Nampula already 2 weeks ago, and now we didn't know how long it would take to get new passports, new residence documents, new papers for the car, proving that it was our car. And of course, all the original documents were in Nampula. And we were despairing. Of course, we did the only thing that all of us Christians can do, the only thing anybody can do in a situation like this, but the first thing Christians think of. We got together and prayed. We gathered the whole family together as soon as Julie and I made our way back home. And it was Saturday afternoon. We got the children together. We all got on our knees before the Lord. And each one of us, from Kent and Sarah and Andrew to my wife and I, got on our knees and we prayed that somehow the Lord would cause that attaché case to make its way back into our hands with all the documents that we needed. And it's the sort of prayer that you pray, and we prayed with all the faith that we could muster. But nevertheless, often you figure, well, if the Lord has let this happen, it's because He intends for us not to have these documents, or not to go on with our plans as we had planned it. But we prayed, and Sunday, we had to stay over in Harare because there was nothing we could do on a Sunday to try to recoup from our loss. We had friends in the churches there in Harare begin praying for us, and other missionaries as well. Well, Monday morning, the very first thing on my list to do to try to get set up so we could return to Nampula was to go to the U.S. Embassy and report the theft of the documents and ask them to start getting us new passports. And that in itself was going to cost quite a bit of money because there were 6 of us. And I went in to the office first thing in the morning, and I said to them, I need to report 6 stolen passports. And the woman who was attending me said, "You wouldn't be Dr. Woodrow, would you?" And I wondered how in the world would she know that. And she saw the confused look on my face, and she said, "I think we have your attaché case." Well, I still wasn't going to give my hopes up until I saw it. And she said, we'll bring it right out to you. And sure enough, she brought it out, and there was our attaché case. But then still, I wanted to know what was in it. And opened it up, and all the money and the camera and the pocket knives and things like that, the flashlights, all been carried off by the thieves. But all the documents, every shred of paper, every piece of trash even that was in the attaché case had been put back inside and returned. And they said that what had happened was Saturday afternoon, about 2 hours after our attaché case was stolen, the guard behind the embassy noticed a white Peugeot with 3 black men in it circling the embassy, going around down the alley behind the embassy, and they did that 2 or 3 times, enough to draw the suspicion of the guard. And so the guard actually wrote down the license plate of this white Peugeot. And the 3rd time that they passed through the alley, out popped an attaché case through the window. And they thought it was a bomb. And so they left it outside the embassy and called the bomb squad. And the bomb squad came and investigated it very carefully and then opened it up. And it didn't explode. And they found out that it was our attaché case because of the passports and the documents inside. And they knew we'd be by first thing on Monday to report the theft. And so we were overjoyed. And it was a wonderful experience for our children. The $2,000 in traveler's checks we were able to get reimbursed. The $900 we lost, the $1,000 we lost. But the important thing was the documents. That's what we needed. It was a wonderful opportunity for our children because that whole week prior to that, we had been talking about faith. Of course, there's a big difference between faith and presumption. Presumption is when we tell God what to do and we think He's going to do it because that's what we want. Whereas faith is when God gives us a promise in His Word and we lay hold of that promise and claim it. And it's something that we know it's His will because He has said, this is my will in His Word. And there are many things we can pray for with complete faith. You know, James tells us that if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth liberally to all men and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed with the wind. Let not that man suppose he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And of course, in the instance that James uses of wisdom, obviously we can pray for wisdom. And we should pray asking for wisdom, expecting to receive it because God has promised that He's going to give us wisdom. But there are other things that we sometimes ask for in prayer that God hasn't actually promised in the Scriptures. And He certainly hadn't promised in the Scriptures. We couldn't know for sure it was God's will to return that attaché case. Perhaps He had other reasons for wanting to hold us up even longer in Harare. Maybe we were supposed to be missionaries to Harare instead of Nampula. So we recognize there's a difference between faith and presumption. And presumption is when you assume that your will is God's will and He's going to do what you want Him to do. Whereas faith is when you just commit your way to the Lord and you trust in Him. But when He's made a definite promise in the Scriptures, we need to pray for that and claim it with all faith, not doubting at all, because then we're doubting God's veracity. But we had discussions during our the whole week with the children on faith and how we can call upon God and how we can pray to Him and He will hear and answer prayers. And of course it was punctuated on Saturday night with this wonderful answer to prayer, which we then discovered on Monday morning. And we were thankful for that, and I told Julie afterwards I would pay $900 for this kind of an experience for my children, to see God answering prayer in such an amazing way. And of course for us it was another wonderful illustration of Proverbs 21:1 that talks about the sovereignty of God over the affairs of men, and even presidents, even kings can only carry out that which is the will of God. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord as rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever He will. And even the heart of a thief, someone who's only interested in stealing what's yours so that he can have it for himself, even the heart of the thief ultimately has to bow before the sovereignty of our God. And thankfully for us it's a wonderful comfort because we can always pray in any such situation, and God can move the hearts of other people in answer to our prayers. And we were thankful for this wonderful illustration of that for our children. But it was another time of growing older rapidly during those 2 days as we were contemplating another trial to try to overcome. But God took care of that one for us in a wonderful way. During the year, the problems continued, We have had difficulty for some time in the medical ministry at Marrere with opposition from various government doctors who are not as appreciative of having a surgical service in a little hospital just 5-10 kilometers away from the big regional referral hospital in northern Mozambique. I don't know exactly how to lead into this except to say that thanks to the constant support of Grace Missions in providing all the supplies that we need to keep our surgical block open, thanks to having a Christian surgical team, and many of you who've read our articles know about Arnaldo, who is my first assistant in the operating room, and he actually does half of the operations himself. And the other fellows on our surgical team are Christians, and they have a real Christian work ethic, which is something you do not find ordinarily amongst the nationals. This idea that we're here to serve people. We're not here just because we need to get some money in order to put food in our mouths, but we're here to serve and minister to needy people, and we're willing to work until the job is done. Because we have a Christian OR team that operates with that kind of a mentality, and because the surgical service is constantly supplied by Grace Missions, we've been able to do a good job on the surgical area. And consequently, we actually have become the referral center for the northern 3 provinces of Nampula. People go right past the city hospital, the big referral hospital in downtown Nampula, to get their operations at Marrere. Not to mention the fact that it's much cheaper at Marrere, but also our results are simply much better because the people are conscientious and diligent workers on the surgical team. And that has generated for us opposition from various quarters. The hospital director of the central hospital tried to close down the surgical block, and you heard stories about that when I was here last year. The chief of surgery at the central hospital also worked from his angle to try to close down surgery at Marrere, and again, I think you heard stories about that last year. I won't repeat those. Then when we had a new provincial director that took over, before I ever had an opportunity to visit with him and get to know him personally, he had already been set up by other people to try to do away with the surgical work at Marrere, and that's all old news, which was brought out last year. We thought things were actually improving. The Lord had turned the tables several times in the midst of this various types of opposition, and was even opening the door, as you all heard about last year, for us to establish our own private Christian surgical medical hospital there in Nampula. But when we got back to Mozambique, the opposition wasn't through. And I often do think, Satan has got his army here on earth, and God has his army as well. Satan has his generals and his majors and his lieutenants and his soldiers, and God has his generals, majors, and lieutenants. And the war is not over just because a battle is won. And when we got back to Nampula, problems began again, only they keep getting higher and higher, and this time the problem reached the ears of the Minister of Health and the ongoing attempt to shut down surgery at Marrere. And this all came about in the month of August of last year. It actually started in the month of July, as I believe the Lord gave my wife and I special preparation for the trials that were about to break open, the new trials. We were reading in our daily devotional, Daily Light on the Daily Path, and the scripture selections for that day had to do with being patient in tribulation. And the very last verse that they had selected amongst several was John 16:33, which is a verse we've all heard before, but for some reason, though it was very familiar, this time it just lodged in my brain, and it kept coming to mind repeatedly in the days that followed, even before we needed that verse. The verse says, "In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." And that's what Jesus was telling his disciples. He was telling them the end from the beginning. You're going to have tribulation. You're going to have problems. But don't let it get you down. I have overcome the world. And we know that we will be more than victors through Jesus Christ. And for some reason, that verse, I just took hold of it. Again, I think because there was special preparation by the Spirit of God for things that were about to happen. Well, it was about 2 weeks later when the bombshell dropped. The vice minister was paying a special visit to the hospital of Marrere, and the hospital had been getting ready for this visit for several days. And I should have had an inkling of foreboding when he showed up with Dr. Simon in tow. And for people who don't remember all of our accounts, Dr. Simon was formerly one of two Mozambican surgeons who was working in times past at the hospital of Nampula when I came to the city and the Ministry of Health decided they wanted to open a second surgical center just 10 kilometers away from the central hospital. Well, this is one of two doctors who frequently did operations there. And from the very beginning, he was against opening a second surgical center that might compete with Central Hospital for cases. And his opposition was open and blatant, and I'd been informed immediately by our own hospital director to beware of this man. Well, 3.5 years ago, he was transferred to Maputo, and from there he was promoted into a position in the Ministry of Health, and he actually became the Inspector General of Hospitals. And he had conducted a special visit to the hospital of Morer several months earlier, and he conducted an inspection, a spot inspection without any notice. It was the first inspection we'd ever had in 5 years, of just the surgical service. And during this time, a nurse walked in and said, "Dr. Simon, do you know that that Arnaldo here is a basic nurse who does surgery in our surgical block?" And I think that nurse was a plant. I think he had been put up to do that. But we don't conceal these things. We have a nurse operating in our operating room, but ever since he began doing this from 1992, I have sent his statistics, his mortality and morbidity reports every year, along with my own, to the Ministry of Health, and we've always had the full support of everyone who's received it. Sometimes tacitly, they don't say anything, they just acknowledge it. Sometimes enthusiastically, saying that they're very happy to see that we've trained a nurse and he's doing such fine work. And the people who've supported us include the former Minister of Health, the chief of the surgical program for the entire country of Mozambique, who trained surgical residents, and the former vice minister, and so forth. But Dr. Simon, now that he was the Inspector General, he knew all these things anyway, he paid a special visit, and I think he had this nurse planted there to come in the midst of his inspection to say, "Dr. Simon, do you know that Arnaldo, a basic nurse, is doing surgery at Morer?" And of course he immediately feigned shock and surprise and horror, and he said, "This will never do. We cannot have this sort of thing going on in our country," even though the reality is that most operations in Mozambique are conducted by nurses, but they're nurses who've received special training and special credentialing for this. Arnaldo has also received special training, but it's not been done by the government. It's been done by myself. And he said, from this moment on, Arnaldo cannot operate in the operating room. And in fact, he put it in writing. He promised to put it in writing, and people who know about Mozambican government officials are always promising to take care of problems, and yet they never get around to doing it. And I was hoping that this would be one of those occasions when he would never get around to putting it into writing that Arnaldo was not to operate, but he did. He went back to the Ministry of Health and he made sure he wrote that letter out, and then even said he wasn't even supposed to set foot in the operating room until he had been properly trained in a government training program, which of course would eliminate all surgery at Morer, because he does half the operations, and the half that I do, I have to have him as my assistant. And so if he can't go in the operating room, we can't do any surgery at all. And I think that was the purpose of his visit in the first place. Well, I won't go through the details. I've already told you a year ago about how the Lord rescued us from that situation. Dr. Vaz, who's the chief of surgery for the entire country, called up just a few weeks later and said he wanted to send residents, nurses, to be trained as surgical technicians by me in our hospital. I said, "Well, I'm happy to do that, but unfortunately the one that I've already trained has just been thrown out of the OR by the Inspector General, and maybe you could help us with that situation." And he did. He took care of that. And it was the same Dr. Simon who was in tow when the vice minister came to inspect the hospital in August. And I should have known that we were just walking into another ambush. And sure enough, when they got to the surgical block, the vice minister came in, and Dr. Simon came in, the provincial health director came in, the hospital director came in, the city director of health came in, and once everybody was inside the operating room, Dr. Simon began to attack the surgical program at Morer, saying that we have sent a document forbidding that this nurse operate here in Morer, and here he is still operating openly and blatantly, and we're still getting his mortality and morbidity reports every year in complete disregard for the directives of the Ministry of Health. And I immediately spoke up to the vice minister. All of this was planned, I know. And I said, well, now you understand, of course, that your letter was written before the visit of Dr. Vaz, and it was not received by us until after Dr. Vaz had overturned that edict. And then I received the unhappy news that Dr. Vaz has no authority in this issue. And this directive has not been overturned. The provincial director of health was standing right beside me, and he's the one who had called me into his office and told me that the directive was overturned and Arnaldo should resume his activities in the operating room, that he had gone personally to the Ministry of Health, and the issue had been discussed at the Ministry of Health, and at that level had been overturned. So I waited for the provincial director of health to speak up and untangle the situation, and he remained studiously silent. And so Dr. Simon began his diatribe again, trying to create basis for just terminating surgery completely at Morer. And no one was coming to our defense. The people who knew the inside story were all remaining silent. And so finally, not knowing what else to do, I said to Dr. Simon and to the vice minister, I said, well, I can answer all of these accusations, and I'd be happy to do so, but I would rather do it in private and not here in front of all these dignitaries and in front of the surgical team. And that was the end of the discussion. The vice minister said, well, it won't be necessary for you to do that. We will send this report directly to the Minister of Health, and you and the Minister of Health can deal with this directly. And I can tell you that the Minister of Health will not be happy when he receives the report that I'm prepared to give him. And so it looked very, very gloomy at that point. And that was the end of the visit. We didn't get to show the OR off at all or talk about anything that we did. That was the purpose of the visit, and it was accomplished. Dr. Simon had his vice minister with him, and now the issue had been kicked up to the Minister of Health himself. Well, that evening, I immediately called the Provincial Director of Health on the phone to find out from him, how is it that we're in this situation, after having been told directly from him that it was approved by the Ministry of Health for Arnaldo to resume operating. And I asked for a private audience with the vice minister so I could bring all of this out into the open, because he obviously didn't know everything that had been worked out. And he told me, well, it won't be possible for you to see the vice minister, because he is leaving tonight and he has leaving in the morning, and he has no vacancies tonight for having an audience with anybody. And furthermore, it's pointless for you to talk with him because Dr. Simon has already won him over, and he is against the continuing with the surgical program at Morer. And so then I called up Dr. Vaz to find out from Dr. Vaz what was going on in the Ministry of Health, since he is in Maputo and in the Ministry of Health. And he was amazed. He couldn't believe when he found out that Dr. Simon had come with the vice minister and had launched this attack in our operating room, because he said, I spoke with Dr. Simon personally, and he gave me his word that he would drop the issue and wouldn't bring it up again. But, intrigue, what good is a person's word in these kinds of situations? So it looked pretty bad, and Dr. Voss said, but I'll go to bat for you again. I'll go straight to the Minister of Health, and I'll put a good word in for you there. Well, for about every other night that week, I was calling Dr. Vaz to find out what was happening. I told Dr. Vaz, look, if Arnaldo cannot operate with me, we can't begin to do all the surgical load that we have to do, and rather than increase our operating hours, decrease our efficiency, or decrease our productivity, or turn away patients who need operations just because we don't have the personnel to do it, I'd rather just not operate. I'd rather just relinquish the contract than to have to try to do all the work myself, which would be impossible, because we do 20 operations a week plus seeing 80 to 100 patients a week in the consultations, and that's more than one person can do alone. And so everything was on the line. I said, you need to talk to the Minister of Health and let him know that it's either continue as we have, or we'll just have to shut down completely. And he said, don't worry, I'll go talk to the Minister of Health. Well, every other day I was calling him on the phone, and every other day he was giving me a gloomier and gloomier report. He couldn't get into the Minister of Health. And so he tried to talk to the Vice Minister, and the Vice Minister rebuffed him and told him, yes, we're going to take up this matter, and it's not going to go well for either Dr. Woodrow or for you, Dr. Vaz. And so he wasn't getting very positive reports. Well, it looked as if things were coming to an end in terms of the medical work at Morer. And the most poignant moment came the Sunday after their visit, when I went to the hospital to get ready for the weekly evangelistic service. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us. Sometimes we preach to 150 people, and it's wonderful because every week we can go in and we have new individuals to share the gospel to, people who probably have never heard the gospel in their entire life. Even certain people who have attended churches will not have heard the gospel of salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ in those churches. And I was contemplating the reality that in a short time we may have to close off the medical end of the ministry, and these evangelistic opportunities would cease. And it was a very poignant moment for myself as it looked as if this might really be something that was about to happen. Well, two of my favorite words in all of Scripture, and I think they're favorite words for all of us, are found in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4. They're the hinge upon which our life story, each one of us, has hinged. It's in Ephesians chapter 2, after Paul gets through describing the situation that exists with every one of us before our salvation, when it talks about how we were once dead in trespasses and sin, and were the slaves of Satan without knowing it, children of wrath even as the rest. And then he begins in the second part of that passage to talk about the wonderful transformation that takes place in the life of a child of God. And the hinge is verse 4. The first two words of verse 4, where he says, "But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love wherewith he loved us, even while we were dead in trespasses and sin, hath quickened us together with Christ Jesus." And this was truly a but God situation, because suddenly, in the darkest hour, the tables were completely turned, and the human agent God used in this was a certain doctor named Dr. Galehood, who is a surgical endocrinologist from George Washington University in the United States in Washington, D.C., and he was traveling throughout South Africa during the year 1996 as a Fulbright scholar to give advice and counsel to the developing African nations. And he had come to Mozambique on a prior trip earlier in the year, and because he was traveling through Nampula, and because we're the only surgical service in the province that does endocrine surgery, we do thyroid operations, he was taken by the health director to visit Marere. And while he was there, I gave him a presentation and delivered all our statistics to him on the cases that we do, our mortality and morbidity, and the results of all our endocrinological surgery. And we hit it off well. One of the reasons we hit it off well is because he is at least a nominal Christian. I thought he was perhaps a genuine Christian, but since I found out later that at any rate he's a nominal Christian who had had some experience working in mission hospitals himself and was very interested in supporting medical missionaries. And so we had a good time together. We got together later in the same week and visited with one another, and he was very impressed with the work that we were doing at Marere. Well, he went back to South Africa and visited 12 other African nations, and he was coming back to Mozambique, unbeknownst to me, just for 1 week, at the very time that all these issues were coming to the attention of the Minister of Health. And in fact, as he tells the story, he was sitting in the anteroom waiting for an audience with the Minister of Health, who was going to thank him for his services rendered on his previous visit to Mozambique, when he came across a document proposing that the Minister of Health abolish surgery at the hospital of Marere. And he remembered us and remembered me and our discussions, and he was very impressed. We were the only place he'd ever visited that was able to present him with statistics on our surgical caseload. And he canceled his audience with the Minister of Health, postponed it till later, and he got with Dr. Vaz, who also was in our corner, and together they drafted an article eulogizing the work that was being done at Marere and praising what was going on there in lofty terms. And when he rescheduled his audience with the Minister of Health, he used the occasion to speak of this wonderful work that was going on at the hospital of Marere. And we do have a number of things that he could bring up that would impress the Minister of Health, and thankfully he was cognizant of those things. And the Minister of Health was quite impressed with what he had to say. Much of his report may have been inflated, but the Minister of Health said, I'm going to Nampula in just a few weeks, and I will make it a point to visit that hospital personally and get to know the work there. And so by the time the Vice Minister got to him with his report, the antidote the venom had already been delivered. And he actually told Dr. Galehood and Dr. Voss later, when Dr. Simon came in with his letter, he said, "What does Dr. Simon know? He's only a child." And so that was negated. First stop in his one-day trip to Nampula, later that same month in August 27th. Well, immediately Dr. Voss phoned me to inform me that the tables had turned and that the Minister of Health himself was going to come and get to know our operating room. This was our opportunity to present to him our desire to build a Christian medical center and receive his authorization direct from the Ministry of Health. But when we learned that he was coming, immediately I thought of a particular patient that I had just seen in clinic that week and scheduled for an operation that I just wish now we could get into the OR and operate on before the minister's visit, because she illustrated the important role that the medical role that the Hospital of Murrah has. She was a relatively wealthy Mozambican who had checked into the Central Hospital downtown to have a routine hysterectomy performed, but the operation was done by a Cuban doctor who was not well prepared, and they encountered problems. And in the course of sewing up the inside of the woman after doing the hysterectomy, he sewed the bladder to the vagina and created an abnormal connection between the bladder and the vagina, so that ever since then she was continually dribbling urine constantly from the bladder into the vagina, and was totally incontinent because of this abnormal connection that had been made between the bladder and the vagina. Well, she had tried. Since she was a woman of some means, she had contracted with the most well-known surgeon in the northern part of Mozambique, the chief of surgery, who in fact had tried to abolish surgery at Murrah for 2 operations. And he had operated on her twice, but these kinds of repairs are very difficult to do, these fistulas, that are most commonly due to trauma during childbirth, but in her case it was trauma during the operation. And these are very difficult to repair, and he tried twice without succeeding. And after spending a great deal of money and having undergone 2 more operations at the Central Hospital without getting the problem resolved, she then flew to Maputo. And she had a consultation with the best-known gynecologist in the country, who treated her for 2 months with medications and refused to operate on her. And we discovered later that he had good reason for refusing to operate on her, but it's a problem that can never be resolved by medications, because the problem is there's a connection that has to be corrected between the bladder and the vagina. She got no better, but after 2 months she finally gave up and she came back home. And so she wore diapers and had this smelly problem with constant urine drainage for 2 years, before learning that at Murrah we repaired those sorts of problems. And I had seen her in the clinic just before receiving word that the Minister of Health was coming, and I had scheduled her for her operation in 2 months and 2 weeks. That's about how long the waiting time was. So she wasn't going to get in for her operation until October. But I thought, oh, if only we could operate on this woman and get her fixed, and then we could present her to the Minister of Health as an example of the reason why this work needs to be developed and not shut down at the Hospital of Murrah. But we don't have phone numbers. Hardly any of our patients have telephones anyway. We had no phone numbers, no addresses. We knew of no way to get hold of this woman. We just had to wait for her to show up in the month of October to do her operation. But the Lord knows all of these things, and it was the most amazing thing. Monday morning, 9 days before the Minister of Health was to come, I showed up at the hospital Monday morning to do our work. And who should be waiting there on the steps in August instead of in October, but this Julia Dominguez. She decided she did not want to wait until October, and she had decided to come to plead with us that we do the operation right now. And she had even skipped breakfast because she wanted to get operated on that day. And that never happens. People just can't do that. We have a full operating schedule planned, months in advance, and you don't just come in and get operated on that day. And how the idea even came into her head, the Lord knows. But of course, we were overjoyed to see her. And we immediately escorted her into the operating room and canceled the other cases so that we could get her done. And as we got her into the operating room, it became apparent why the gynecologist in Maputo had refused to operate on her. She was totally terrified of anything surgical, and perhaps she had good reason to be after having 3 unsuccessful operations. But the first thing that we had to do before actually carrying out the operation was just an examination to actually visualize, see directly this fistula that we were going to have to repair during the operation. And that's a totally painless procedure. But just lying on the operating table was enough to send her into a panic. And I could not carry out this exam without the whole OR team having to climb onto the woman, and she was a very stout, hefty woman, holding down her arms and her legs so that I would be able to get a look at this fistula so we could plan the ensuing operation. Then after that we had to catheterize her, and it was the same thing again. It's not a painful procedure to be catheterized. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, but again she was just terrified, and again it was the case of everybody piling on and everybody grabbing an arm and a leg and an elbow and a toe and immobilizing so that we could get that done. And you'd have thought we were playing rugby on the OR table instead of treating a patient. But she, in spite of her terror, she was going to go through with the procedure. And of course I was amazed when I saw all of this. I wondered, how in the world did this woman ever have the courage to come in to plan an operation, let alone to come in early and have it done 2 months early? But we knew that this was of the Lord, had to have been of the Lord. We knew why she was on our OR table. And for the same reason, we had a lot of confidence that even if we called in the laundrymen and had them do the operation, she was going to come out okay. Because there was another hand at work in all of this besides our own. And sure enough, everything went well. We did the operation under spinal anesthesia because we did not have the expertise to put people to sleep, and of course that was another ordeal for her. She didn't feel anything at all, but she was awake during the operation, and she pleaded with us to be put to sleep, but we couldn't do that. And the operation went very well, and she had a totally uneventful recovery, and she had a catheter in place for 7 days. The 8th day, or the 7th day after the operation, we pulled the catheter out, and she began voiding normally, no leaks whatsoever. And the 8th day after her operation was when the Minister of Health conducted his visit. And of course, we made sure she was there in the hospital. And we had a very meticulously rehearsed presentation prepared. It took 30 minutes. Our only concern was that the Minister of Health might not be willing to stand there for 30 minutes in the surgical block while we went through all of our presentation. But we had a lot of pictures. Many of you have seen some of our OR pictures of cases that we treated at Morer. We had reams of statistics and handouts and so forth, and a real-life patient demonstration, which we concluded with our Julia Domingos and brought her in and gave him the history of her medical condition. And by the grace of God, and I think we all recognize literally by the grace of God, it had only taken the hospital of Morer 12 days, 1 consultation, and 1 operation to resolve a problem that 2 regional referral hospitals and the leading specialists in the province and in the nation over 2 years to treat with much expense and much lost time and inefficiency without being able to succeed in resolving the problem. And yet we were able to take care of it in short order. And he was impressed. And the Minister of Health, afterwards when we were leaving, the Provincial Director of Health pulled me aside and he said, "I know everything's going to go really well from that presentation." And sure enough, the Minister of Health invited me to have dinner with him that evening, to sit down. It was the only evening that he was in Nampula, and he invited me to have dinner with him that evening to present any concerns that I had. And so I told him, well, we have a problem with needing authorization for Arnaldo in writing to operate in the OR. He said, I'll take care of that. And he did. He put it in writing, and we now have a document straight from the Minister of Health saying that Arnaldo can do anything in the operating room as long as I take full responsibility for the consequences. And then I said, and also we would like to build a private Christian surgical clinic in Nampula, and we'll need your authorization. And he said, you have it. And the paperwork has just finally been processed, and it's in the Ministry of Health, and we're waiting his signature. But we were thankful for that. And we were just amazed, again, at how God can turn the tables. And one of my favorite psalms for a long time has been Psalm 107. It's a psalm that exhorts us to give praise and thanksgiving to God. And then it gives us a variety of reasons. We heard this morning from Psalm 46, or 36, I believe it was, why we should give praise and thanks to God. And in Psalm 107, he gives us about 6 reasons. And in the first paragraph, he talks about wanderers wooed. People who are lost, and they know they're lost, and they're looking for the right way. And God in his graciousness woos them and draws them to himself, draws them to the Christ. to the cross where they can be saved. And that's one reason to give thanks to God, because of wanderers wooed, and some of us were brought into the kingdom that way. And then in the second paragraph, it talks about rebels reclaimed. There are people who don't know that they're lost, and they're not looking for Christ, and they're not looking for the right way. They're rebelling, and they're running from Christ, and this happens often with the children of Christians who've grown up in the church, but they'll have nothing of it. They've heard the truth, and they know the way of salvation, but they won't have anything to do with it. And this passage talks about how God brings such individuals into the depths of despair. He brings them into hard times for the very purpose of showing them that it's the wages of serving Satan are not worth it, and to reclaim these rebels and bring them back to himself. And then the third thing, it goes through dullards delivered. And there are times when all of us, because of our ignorance or our willfulness, make foolish mistakes and foolish decisions, and we get into trouble because of that. But God is gracious to hear us when we cry to Him and bring us to Himself. And then it talks about storms stilled through no fault of our own. Many times we find ourselves in the furnace of affliction, and we think that there's no way we're going to escape this without serious injury. And yet God comes in and He stills the storm, and we emerge unscathed. And another reason to give thanks to God. But then, and the last reason He gives is tables turned. And in the last paragraph it talks about how our God can change rivers into a wilderness and springs of water into a thirsty ground. A fruitful land He turns into a salt waste. He changes a wilderness into a pool of water, and a dry land into springs of water. He pours contempt upon princes on the one hand. He makes them wander in a pathless waste. But He sets the needy securely on high away from affliction and makes His families like a flock. The reality is that we serve a God who can turn the tables. And I was in Myrtle's bathroom the other day, and I saw you had on the wall 10 blessings that we can always thank God for. And one of them was this very thing, that God can change any situation, and He can do it in only moments. And no matter how much in the depths of despair we may be, if we're a Christian, we always remember that we have a God who can turn the tables. And I often think of David. God often brings us to the darkest hour just before He's about to unleash a wonderful blessing. You know, Adam had to be made aware of his loneliness before he could appreciate the wonderful gift that Eve was. And so God knew it wasn't good for Adam to be alone, but maybe Adam didn't know it yet. And so God brought all the animals to Adam to see if there were any that would be a suitable companion. God knew, but Adam didn't know until he saw all the animals come by, and the chimpanzee just wasn't good enough, and the elephant was too big, and this was something wrong with all of them. And Adam had to be aware of his need so that he could appreciate the wonderful blessing that God had in store for him just after his next nap when He presented Eve. And with David as well, before David received word that he was going to be the next king of Israel, that his enemies had perished in the battle. You remember how his own village had been attacked, and all the wives and all the children of the men and all the wealth had been carried off. And they were expecting to come back with great plunder from their own raids, and instead they came back to find their own city burned with fire, their wives and children, everything lost. But that was just God bringing him to the depths of despair before he was about to turn the tables. And in a short time later, they had their wives and their children back. They had all their plunder back, plus much more plunder than they imagined, and plus the news now that Saul, his enemy, his life had been taken by the Lord, and now the way was clear for David to become the king of Israel. And so the Lord, our God, is a God who turns tables. And it was a wonderful illustration for us of God doing that in the midst of the opposition that we faced. As on the one hand, it was our desire to establish a privately owned, Christian-operated medical center, and on the other hand, there were the foes who were trying to do away with even the work that we were doing at Marrere. And when it looked as if everything was against us, God turned the tables. And we're thankful for that, and we're thankful for the prayers of people who are constantly supporting us in this regard. With regard to this medical surgical hospital that we're trying to get started in Mozambique, I talked about this quite a bit last year because it was something that was just beginning to blossom. We'd been promised land in January of last year. And when I returned from our vacation here, we were expecting the land to be delivered to us. But the paperwork took a long time, and we got all the way into October, and the land still hadn't, the paperwork hadn't been drawn up. Everything was go, but it was just getting the government officials to put their signatures on the paperwork so the land would be delivered to us. Well, we came up to the October the 12th, and we were concerned not only about the land, but other things that we had to do in order to build a hospital was to get a reliable source of water. And the city water is very unreliable, as we know from our own personal experience. And so we decided we would try to drill the borehole. And the company that was going to drill the borehole for us said that they had the truck in town for just that week, and if we would get the borehole drilled that very week, oh goodness, time is up. If we would get the borehole drilled that very week, they would do it at a cut rate price. But before they could drill the borehole, we had to get the legal title to the land, which still wasn't clear yet. And so that was a matter of praying, Lord, is it your will for us to drill this borehole? And if so, we need to have this paperwork signed. It's been delayed for so long. Well, 15 minutes before the offices closed, at the deadline day, they actually processed the paperwork. We were able to get it into the hands of the South African company, authorizing them to drill the borehole. And so they went out the next day and drilled the borehole. And of course, as you all know, it was bad news. They got just a little bit of water, they said, as they were drilling through. They went down to 34 meters, and after that they said it was pointless in going deeper. And because it looked like it was a dry hole, they charged us the very minimum. Initially we'd been quoted by another company $13,500 for the whole job, and just to drill the hole they charged us only $2,500. And they apologized profusely for the fact that it appeared to be a dry well and wasn't going to be sufficient for what we needed. They said that it might nevertheless be enough for 2 houses to supply 2 families with water, and it might be worth putting a pump on it for that purpose. But it wouldn't supply water for a hospital and for all the personnel who would be living on the property. It's about 3.5 hectares of land that we have. And so in order to make the decision whether it was worth putting putting a pump on it or just letting it fill in with dirt again, they offered to put a pump on it temporarily and test it out and see what the maximum production of the well was. Well, that was in October. And for a whole variety of reasons, vacations and other hassles and so forth, they couldn't get the pump and mount it on the well until January of this year. And during this time, everyone was praying. I know you all were praying, we were praying. At least, even though they told us it looked like it was almost a dry well, we were still praying that the Lord would somehow make water come out of the rock, just like He did for Moses and the Israelites. And we all had the boldness to continue praying until we got the final word on the well. And amazingly, in January, when they finally put the pump on, they thought it was going to be such a poor well that they only put a hand pump on it. They didn't bother putting an electric pump that could pump at a high rate. They put a hand pump on that would only pump at 1,500 liters per hour. And when they put the pump down and started pumping, they couldn't pump it dry. And what they have to do is they have to pump it dry and then let it fill up for an hour and see how much water goes into the borehole in the space of 1 hour, and that tells you its maximum production. Well, they couldn't get it pumped dry to begin with. And so it was producing over 1,500 liters an hour minimum, which is more than enough for a 150-bed hospital and 3 expatriate families and all the other Africans who would be living on the property. And they couldn't come up with an explanation for it. And of course I can't either, except that people were praying. But it did worry me because when the well was dry, when the borehole appeared to be relatively dry, there was water in it. They knew there was water in it, but they thought it wasn't enough. When it appeared to be dry, it was at the end of the dry season. And when they finally put the pump on it, it was the end of the rainy season. And so, of course, that leaves doubts in my mind, but they said, no, that can't make, it's because it's a borehole, we're not drawing surface water, we're getting water from down under the rocks. And it shouldn't make a difference, they say, of more than 200 or 300 liters an hour between the rainy season and the dry season. But they were at a loss. They couldn't explain it. And of course, how can they explain it if it's of the Lord? But on the other hand, it creates doubts in my own mind. Maybe they really don't know that well what they're doing. But if we continue to have good water during the dry season, then we'll know for sure that we have a marvelous well, a marvelous borehole. But that was another exciting event that's taken place in the past year. 3 occasions when we thought we were in a hopeless situation. And 3 occasions when through prayer and through people praying, God has turned the tables. We've got a dry well that produces so much water they can't pump it dry. We've got the attaché case that the thieves decided to give all the documents back. And then we have the authorization to proceed with the construction of a private medical center when we thought that we weren't even going to be, we thought we would be closing off the medical ministry completely and just continuing on with the church planting ministry just a few months ago. So we give thanks to God that we have a God who does turn tables. And it's a lesson that we need to remember because it comes up in all of our lives, and I know it will continue to happen in our ministry in Mozambique. And it's just been encouraging for us, although it's also discouraging. I think 90% of the time we spend discouraged. And then the answer comes, and you're real encouraged and excited, but then a week later, you're back in the furnace of afflictions again. So you spend a lot of time in the depths, and it seems not so much time on the mountaintops, but the lesson that you have to take away from it, of course, always is that even though God sometimes delays in His deliverance, He is a faithful God. Whether He removes the obstacle before it actually strikes us in the face, or if He takes care of it after the fact, He still is a faithful God, and we should always pray and persevere in prayer and never give up hope. So we appreciate your prayers. I had intended also to talk about the church ministry. That has been very fitful, and I think there will be opportunities probably to just present to the whole church things which the Lord is doing, and I'll want to be sure to emphasize that because the spiritual ministry is what we're there for, and it has been very fitful. We've had steps forward and steps backwards over the past year, and we need prayer in the church ministry. The church numerically is stronger than it ever has been. It continues to grow. But in terms of spiritual maturity, we are weaker than we've been in a long time. We've lost a lot of our strong men. Some of them have been sent out to establish other churches, sister churches affiliated with us. And others have just been transferred through their jobs to other locations. And we can't send them out to establish churches because they're not that mature. But we've lost a lot of our leadership through those two things during the past year, and so our church needs prayer that will regroup and be strengthened. We haven't had a split, if anybody's thinking that that's what I'm saying between the lines. It hasn't been that, but we've lost most of our leaders through job transfers. And again, one of them was in a position to be a pastor, so we've commissioned him as a missionary, and he's going to establish another church where he is, Lord willing. But the others, we've just lost them without any benefit in the process. But I won't go into that just now, later. Appreciate your attention, and I very much appreciate your prayers over the past year. Maybe we should end with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we do thank you that you are a God of power, a God of grace, a God of love, a God of mercy, a God of kindness, where your children are concerned. Father, we look forward to what you have in store for us, not as those who can only anticipate judgment because of their sins, but as those who have been pardoned through Jesus Christ, those who have been brought near to you according to your own elective love and your kindness and your goodness as it has been